When I started college, I really wasn't interested in psychology at all. I had some vague sense that I wanted to be some sort of a scientist or a writer, but psychology just didn't interest me. I thought it was all about crazy people, how to do therapy, helping people with their problems. And it might sound awful to say this, but I really wasn't interested in that at all. It wasn't until I stumbled into an introduction to psychology course, probably because it fit my schedule, that my eyes were opened up to all the cool things that happen in psychology. So I want to start this part of the course by just letting you know how broad the field is and what some of the different areas are. The first subfield of psychology that I'm going to talk about is experimental psychology. This is a nice fit for people who are interested in the sciences, but maybe like me didn't realize that psychology is a science. So, experimental psychologists do research for a living. A lot of us are professors who also teach, but some experimental psychologists work in industry, some of them work for the government. There are all kinds of job opportunities. And experimental psychology is furthermore broken down into different areas. The traditional areas of experimental psychology are topics like learning, motivation, emotion, sensation, and perception. Um, those have now kind of become a part of cognitive psychology, which is the study of, for want of a better way to describe it, how people think. How does memory work? How do we solve problems? How do we pay attention to some things and filter out other things? So, cognitive psychologists are interested in those kinds of questions. Neuroscientists are interested in the biological part of psychology. How does the brain work? How does the nervous system function? What is the relationship between physiological processes and behavior? Comparative psychology is the study of animal behavior, sometimes because studying animals can teach us a lot about humans, but a lot of comparative psychologists are simply interested in animal behavior, and they're not worried about whether or not we can learn more about humans by studying animals. Developmental psychology, sometimes called lifespan psychology, is concerned with how people change over time, from the time you're born through childhood, adolescence, well into old age. How are people different at different stages of life? And social personality psychology is the study of people in social situations. What makes people attracted to each other? How do people change their attitudes? What are the causes of aggression? How are people in groups different from people that are individuals? And what makes people different from each other? What makes one individual's personality different from another's? So, experimental psychologists usually describe themselves as social psychologists or developmental psychologists or cognitive psychologists, depending on their specialty. So, if you're interested in science and research, experimental psychology may be the part of the field that you find most interesting. Most of you are probably more interested in clinical, counseling, and health psychology than many of the other areas of psychology. These fields are the more stereotypical psychological fields where you're helping people with problems. Clinical and counseling psychologists deal with people who are having some sort of mental health issues. There's a very blurry distinction between clinical and counseling psych, but to the extent that I can describe it at all, clinical psychologists are trained to help people with severe mental illness, like schizophrenia, for example. Counseling psychologists are trained to work more with so-called normal people who are having some sort of difficult life situation. Maybe they're dealing with an addiction, or they're grieving over the loss of a loved one, or they've recently been through a divorce. Counseling psychologists help them get through that. But having said that, clinical and counseling psychologists do very similar kinds of work. Health psychologists are more interested in how to help people lead physically healthy lives. So they're interested in things like how people handle stress, how to help people deal with addiction, how to make people eat healthy. So health psychologists are more concerned with the physical, perhaps, than the mental health of the person. Another area of psychology that many students don't think about right off the bat is industrial organizational psychology. This is, excuse me, psychology applied to business. Um, and so, if you're interested in the business world and you want to make some money, industrial organizational psychology is probably the way to go. Um, Industrial organizational psychologists often work in consulting firms that are hired by corporations to come in and solve human resource problems. But a lot of them also work for the government, and a lot of them are professors at universities and colleges. You can break industrial organizational psychology down into different areas. Personnel psychologists are the ones who are concerned with finding ways to decide how to hire people and how to evaluate people on the job. So they develop psychological tests, they conduct validity and reliability studies of those tests, they help companies develop performance appraisal systems. Organizational behavior, on the other hand, is a subfield where you're more interested in the social aspect of the organization as a whole. They study communication patterns, leadership styles, and that sort of thing. Consumer psychology is applying psychology to advertising. Why do people buy the things they do? What are the ways in which companies can present their products in ways that will get people to buy them? Engineering psychology and human factors um, are often considered a separate category, but I'm throwing them in here because they're very applied. This is designing machinery, like computer interfaces and cockpits and airplanes, to be used efficiently by humans. So if you're interested in engineering kinds of questions, this might be an area of psychology that's particularly attractive to you. And finally, educational psychology. A lot of psychologists are interested in the learning process and they work in school systems. So some of you may have worked with educational psychologists. They administer tests to children in schools. They help teachers develop learning plans for kids with special needs. Some educational psychologists move into the corporate world where they help companies design research and training programs, orienting people to jobs. What's the best way to teach people new skills? That sort of thing. So no matter what your interests are, there's some way to tie it in with psychology. You'll notice that this wheel that's on the slide right now shows how you can connect psychology with all of the other disciplines, ranging from computer science to psychiatry and law, criminology. We've even had psychology majors combine their major with things like theater. So, in a nutshell, psychology is a very diverse field and something that I think I hope you're going to enjoy. So throughout the rest of this term, we're going to move from module to module to module, examining many of these different subfields. So where does this go then? No, I'm just...
Do a search if you can't find it.